Hello, my name is Andrew and I'm a Heritage Learning and Outreach Officer with Norfolk County Council. This short presentation is about Stracey Arms Drainage Mill, which, when it was built in 1883, was one of the most technologically advanced of its type on the Norfolk Broads. It's currently being restored as part of the Mill and the Marshfolk project, which is being very generously supported by a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. During this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to the mill by giving details of who built it, who it was built for, how it worked and why it is so special. I'll also say a few things about the Halvergate Marshes, this great triangle of grazing pasture between Great Yarmouth, Acle and Reedham, which the mill was built to drain, along with many others. I'll also introduce the marsh families that lived at Stracey Arms and who ran the mill and managed the marshes. And finally, I'll bring you up to date with the restoration project so far and our plans for the future. So I'll start with the mill itself, and you can see here an image of Stracey Arms that was created in 1934. The mill is 51 years old and in full working order. Photographs of the mill taken during its working life show a tall, proud, brick-built mill surrounded by a few shrubs and small trees. And this is how the mill looked between October 2018 and November 2021. You can see it in the centre of this photograph, surrounded by a cluster of buildings and compounds. The cap was removed from the tower in 2018 and a temporary corrugated iron roof was put on to keep it watertight while the building work was carried out. This included work on the water lane leading to the mill, repointing of the external brickwork of the tower and applying a lime render to the internal walls. This work was done by the conservation builders R&J Hogg Limited of Coney Weston. The cap was removed from the site to be restored in the yard of the Norfolk millwright Richard Seago. You can also see from this aerial photograph that the mill stands between the south bank of the River Bure on the left and the part of the A47 known as the Acle Strait on the right, midway between Acle and Great Yarmouth in Norfolk. This is an older aerial photo taken from a similar position as the last one we saw. It gives an idea of how the mill will look when the current restoration is complete. You might also detect from this series of images that there have been many developments around the mill during its lifetime, and these changes have added considerably to the complexity of the current restoration project. Stracey Arms was built during the golden age of Victorian engineering, and its design took advantage of all the latest innovations in mill technology. It had cast iron shafts and gears, a fantail mechanism, patent sails and an Appold turbine. The cast iron components included the upright shaft and the wind shaft, the brake wheel, the wallower and the crown wheel gear. In older mills these would originally have been made from wood. It had a fantail mechanism which meant that the cap automatically rotated to face the wind when the wind changed direction. In older mills a tail pull was used to manually haul the cap round into the correct position. The sails fitted at Stracey were patent sails. These had shutters that could be closed and opened while the sails were still rotating. These were an obvious advantage on the old cloth sails of former mills, which could only be altered if the mill was stopped from working. And finally, rather than having a scoop wheel to lift water, Stracey Arms was fitted with a centrifugal pump based on the design of John Appold. He'd first demonstrated the efficiency of his invention at the Great Exhibition in 1851. Fantails, patent sails and turbines can be seen on other mills in the Broads. Many were adapted to accommodate these new bits of equipment later in their lives, but at Stracey they were installed at the outset. Stracey Arms Drainage Mill was constructed in 1883 by the engineer and millwright Richard Barnes, the owner of Southtown Ironworks in Great Yarmouth. He had worked on other mills in the area, most notably the Burney Arms, which he converted into a drainage mill. It was previously used to make an ingredient for the production of cement. And at the 7 Mile site on the River Yare, Barnes built a steam engine and steam engine house. Unfortunately, while the building has been preserved, the machinery was lost many years ago, or we have our images like that shown on the left hand side here. But Barnes' main trade was the production of steam capstans for hauling in fishing nets. You can see an advert for one of his engines for fishing boats here. This appeared in the Yarmouth Independent in December 1879, a period of time when there was a considerable fleet of fishing vessels operating out of the port at Great Yarmouth. The mill was built for Sir Henry Stracey of Rackheath Hall. This is an image of him that appeared in Vanity Fair in 1875, where he was portrayed as a country gentleman. Sir Henry was a major landowner, and between 1855 and 1869 he was also a Conservative MP representing East Norfolk, Great Yarmouth and Norwich. So the mill is very special. Today it is recognised as a Grade 2-star listed building, a complete modern drainage mill retaining its original machinery. It is the only example of an entire mill built by Richard Barnes that we know of. So we know when, for who and by whom it was built, but why was the mill required at all? To answer that, we need to talk about the Halvergate Marshes. Stracey Arms is one of the many mills that were built across the Halvergate Marshes. It probably has the densest concentration of windmills anywhere in England, but these were all drainage mills, not the grain windmills that we might be used to seeing in other parts of the country. Around 10 square miles of the marsh, arranged in a rough triangle between Great Yarmouth in the east and Acle and Reedham in the west, are at or around sea level. It used to form part of a great estuary, but is now managed as an extensive area for grazing cattle. In order to ensure a high-quality pasture, the marshes need to be managed to prevent flooding, and an intricate system of foot drains, channels and dikes has been developed over time. These led to drainage mills which pumped water to the rivers to be discharged into the sea. Stracey Arms is labelled SA on this map, and the other symbols represent the site of other known drainage mills across the marshes. As you can see in this image, cattle are still kept on the marshes, and it's still important that water levels are managed. They need to be high enough to keep the cattle in their fields. The dikes themselves are used as field boundaries rather than using hedges or walls. But the water also needs to stay low enough so that the grass does not become submerged. This would reduce the quality of the pasture and result in decreased yields. The management techniques that produce this environment also produce a habitat that's ideal for a range of other species other than cattle, and large areas of the marsh are now specifically managed for the benefit of wildlife. The mills needed someone to run them, the cattle needed people to look after them, and the drainage ditches needed to be kept clear of vegetation and mud, otherwise they'd eventually become blocked. The people who did this work were called marshmen, and they lived out on the marshes with their families, usually in a house built close to the mill they were responsible for running. And it's these folk we'll talk about next. When Stracey Arms Mill was built in 1883, it was run by George Arnott. This is the only photograph we have of George Arnott, and sadly it's the only photograph we have of any of the Arnotts that were associated with the site. The mill was built to replace a former mill that had stood on the same spot. You can see here, marked on the tithe map from around 1840. The mill was run by George's father, William Arnott, who came from Rackheath with his family in the 1830s. You can also see that the Stracey Arms indicated on this map is actually the name of a public house on the Acle side of the mill. For the whole of its working life, the mill was actually known as Arnott's Mill, after the family that ran it. George Arnott had inherited the role from his father, William. After George came his son, also called George, and then his grandson, Leonard. When Leonard died in 1937, it ended over a century of association between the Arnotts and the mill. The Acle New Road, now the A47, was built in 1831, but the railway from Norwich to Great Yarmouth wasn't opened until 1883, the same year that Stracey Arms was built. You can see that the train line now appears on this Ordnance Survey map from 1905, and of course the drainage pump indicated on this map is the present-day Stracey Arms drainage mill. William, the two Georges and Leonard Arnott all worked as marshmen. It was quite common for the role of marshman to be inherited. The marshmen didn't own the cattle they looked after. Instead, the owners of the cattle hired the marsh and the marshmen that looked after them at local auctions, such as this one that was advertised to take place in Great Yarmouth in 1923. Following the death of Leonard Arnott, the most notable marshman at the mill was Fred Mutton. He was a member of a well-known local marsh family, and as you can see in these images, it wasn't just Marsh men who did the work. One of Fred's daughters can be seen driving cattle along the branch road from Halvergate to the old Stracy Arms Inn. The Muttons continued to live at Stracy Arms until the 1960s. But by the time the Muttons came to the mill, an electric pump had been installed in a purpose-built brick building next to the mill. This electric pump had taken over the drainage function, so the mill became redundant. And then, during World War II, the tower was converted into a multi-storey pillbox by puncturing the walls to create a number of gun loops or embrasures on the ground and first floors. Two of the windows were bricked up to produce embrasures. Here you can see the shape of one of the old windows marked out by the brick that was used to fill it in. One of the two original entrances to the mill were also sealed. This mill box, as you might call it, was part of the area's system of home defences, designed to ward off the invasion by German forces that everyone expected after the British retreat from Dunkirk in 1940. Of course, this invasion never materialised, and these defences were never tested. In the years following the war, Stracy Arms, like many other redundant drainage mills across the Broads, began to fall into disrepair and decay. The loss of these mills and the industrial heritage they represented did not go unnoticed. In 1963, the Norfolk Windmills Trust was established with the aim of preserving the most important examples. The owner of Stracy Arms at this time was Lady Kathleen Stracy. She generously contributed to the restoration of the mill before gifting it to Norfolk County Council in 1965. The mill has been maintained as a heritage asset and tourist attraction by Norfolk Windmills Trust on their behalf ever since. That initial restoration was carried out by a local firm of millwrights, Smithdales of Acle, and I think these pictures taken at the mill in 1961 give a revealing insight into the health and safety procedures, or lack of them, that were adhered to at the time. During this restoration, the embrasures that had been created during the war were blocked off, and the windows were reinstated. The mill was left in the best condition it had been in for around 30 years or so, as you can see from this pair of images. Of course, the restoration of such a structure can never be a one-off event, and while the repairs carried out in the 1960s ensured that the immediate threat to the integrity of the mill was averted, over time, obviously, other interventions have been necessary. Wind, rain, snow, ice, these all take their toll on these machines, even when they're not being used. Several instances of damage caused by storms and subsequent repair work done on the mill have been recorded in the press over the years. We've strayed away a little from the lives of the Marsh families, so we should turn now to the current project to restore the mill, which has been given the name The Mill and the Marsh Folk. As you can see in this photo, taken just before the cap was removed in 2018, the mill was by that point in quite a distressed state. There were no blades on the fantail at the back of the cap, no sails on the stocks at the front of the cap, and the general condition of the woodwork and on other areas of the mill was poor and getting worse. The ambitions for the project were designed to be wider than just the restoration of the mill structure. A programme of public events, educational activities, and a new suite of interpretation for visitors to the mill was envisaged. Of course, the project was conceived before coronavirus came along, so we've had to adapt to circumstances accordingly. We have been able to run our first season of events, all under the theme of landscape and wildlife. We had an online talk about the wildlife of the Halvergate Marshes, followed a couple of days later by a guided walk across the marshes, binoculars at the ready. We were ably assisted by our guide, Carl Chapman, who was able to identify the species that we spotted, and several that we could only hear. We've also run 2 day schools in Acle, one revealing the history of cartography in Britain and the rich archive of historic maps that we now have access to, both physically and online, and another about interpreting historic landscapes from features that are apparent from surveys, mapping and field walking. These were both led by academics from the University of East Anglia. And in September, we were able to show visitors inside the mill for the first time since building work was complete as part of Heritage Open Days. This was one of the adverts that we had for that event, and it shows the mill after all the building work had been completed. and you'll notice that one of the World War II embrasures is back. To support the new information displays that are being created for the mill, we decided to reopen an embrasure on the ground floor. The two images at the top here are from outside and inside the mill. Also, we asked that the lime render not be applied over the other areas where gun loops were positioned, so it's now possible when visiting the mill for the first time in over 50 years to see where all the embrasures were positioned. So the most obvious building work was to the mill itself, but work has gone on in other areas, most notably the water lane that leads to the mill. So a before and after shot here. On the left you can just about make out the yellow warning sign on an electric cable, which is now safely housed above the water lane. When the walkway was lifted, the cable was found to be in quite a dangerous state, a potentially shocking discovery, you might say. And here, leading up to the turbine housing, you can see several decades worth of mud that had built up on the base of the water lane. Every aspect of the mill cap has been lovingly restored by the millwright, from nuts and bolts to gears and wheels. The range of skills required to produce and restore both the metal and wooden components of a windmill may go some way to explain why millwrighting is now recognised as a critically endangered craft by the Heritage Crafts Association. The millwrighting work involves a lot of heavy lifting. When you want to turn the cap frame over, for instance, to fit the wheels that allow it to rotate on the top of the tower, you need a crane to help. And here are the wheels being test fitted, and yes, the millwright has built a mill in his own garden. The large gear here is called the brake wheel, and the axle it's attached to is known as the windshaft. On the right-hand part of the windshaft is the canister where the stocks for the sails will be housed. An examination of the windshaft during the restoration project revealed some imperfections in the original Victorian casting of the iron. This could have caused the canister to fail. It was an unexpected and unwelcome discovery, but one that we resolved with specialist help. And this is part of the mechanism for opening and closing the shutters on the sails. The Y wheel, as it's called, is turned using a chain. A gear causes a striking rod which passes right the way through the windshaft to the sails at the front to move either forward or backward, and which causes the shutters on the sails to open or close. This is the restored 8-bladed fantail in the millwright's workshop. You can see Richard, the millwright, in the picture on the left. In this series of images, you can see the fly frame during construction and fitting to the cap frame. It's the fly frame that holds the fantail up at the back of the cap. So this is the restored mill cap, looking rather wonderful after being delivered back to the site in October 2021. The top of the cap is open to allow chains through, which will be necessary for it to be lifted by crane back onto the mill tower. And I'm delighted to say that on Thursday, the 16th of December 2021, we were able to complete the lift. So if you're travelling along the Acle Strait, A47, you will now be able to enjoy the magnificent sight of the tower and the cap reunited. Of course, there'll still be something missing. Richard the millwright is now constructing the sails, and we look forward to seeing those being installed towards the end of 2022. So from 2023 and the 140th anniversary of the construction of the mill, Stracey will be back to looking its best. The sails should be able to turn, volunteers should be able to get involved in maintaining and running the mill, and visitors will be welcome back to enjoy the site and learn about the mill, the Halvergate marshes, and the folk who for many years lived in and looked after the surrounding landscape. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with progress by subscribing to our free quarterly e-newsletter, following our Facebook page, or watching some of the videos we have uploaded onto the Stracey Arms playlist on Norfolk Windmills Trust YouTube channel. If you would like more information about any of these, have any questions about the project, or are interested in volunteering opportunities at the mill, please send me a message. Our email address is norfolkmills@norfolk.gov.uk. I hope you've enjoyed this potted history of the mill, the marsh and the marsh folk, and hearing about the restoration project. Many thanks for listening.